I'd like to turn to Dr. Sandra Stotsky. She is Professor of Education at the University of Arkansas, Emeritus of the University of Arkansas. She held the 21st Century Chair in Teacher Equality. She serves as a Senior Associate Commissioner, a professional position at the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education from 1999 to 2003. She was in charge of developing and revising the K-12 standards, teacher's license test, and teacher administrator license and regulations. She served in the Massachusetts Board of Elementary and Education from 2006 to 2010. She's on the National Mathematics Advisory Panel from 2006 to 2008 and on the Common Core Validation Committee from 2009 to 2010. She's one of 5 members of the validation committee who would not sign off on the standards were validated. She has published extensively in professional journals and written several books. Her undergraduate work was at the University of Michigan and completed a doctorate in reading research at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Dr. Stotsky.
Thank you very much. Is this also?
It's on.
Thank you. Let me begin with the context for the panel discussion today, because I have been doing an extensive amount of traveling around the country and testifying in various states. There are about 20 to 25 states right now that have legislation in various stages of being heard, discussed in the House or the Senate or both, that are attempts to get out of the sticky jar of molasses that they were put into by the vote of their State Board of Education, their governor's approval, and their Commissioner of Education's vote or approval in 2010, often before the final version of Common Core standards were out, or within hours, if not days, after they came out. So that there is the germ of the complaint that there was no process followed for the development and approval, discussion of all of the serious implications of these seemingly free lunch standards for what was going to happen to not only K-12, but 4 years of college afterwards. There were 4 groups of people basically excluded from participating in the development of these standards. This remains a huge issue today because they are now all rising, and that is why we see these attempts at legislation in about 20 to 25 states. First were parents. They were nowhere to be seen when these standards were being developed. Next were teachers themselves, particularly high school math teachers and high school English teachers. Then there were state legislators who were eventually going to pick up the tab. They were not involved. They didn't even know until last year what their state boards of education had voted on in 2010. And then local school boards are now finding out that they basically have lost all of their powers over curriculum instruction as they thought they once had. So this is now emerging as another source of concern, issues, complaints, and pressure behind legislators to get some legislation on the books. I'm going to skip briefly to tell you what my own philosophy was when I was developing all of the standards for K-12 in Massachusetts. First of all, the philosophy behind what we did at that time was to increase all students' achievement. We weren't concerned about the closing of the gap so much as we were concerned about how to raise all groups' achievement, and that is what we have achieved over time with the standards and other measures that we were involved in, because it's far more complex than just standards alone, to improve the caliber of our public schools, which have been declining for almost 50 years. This is not a new problem, and Common Core simply aggravates it and makes it even more difficult to get at the real sources of the issue. Second, we were concerned with content knowledge in as many subjects as we could, how to improve and increase student content knowledge, without which critical thinking simply doesn't take place. Third, and most important and most neglected by the current reform, so-called reform efforts, were the efforts I made in particular to strengthen teacher education through professional development criteria for practicing teachers, through licensure tests for prospective teachers. And those have been measures that have been just about totally neglected across the board and need to be focused on. There is no way you can have first-class standards taught to without a strong teacher corps. We do not have first-class standards in Common Core, and we do not want to see mediocre standards frozen in time by textbook publishers, as they now are, and by teacher education institutions that are now going to be accredited on how well they teach to Common Core's standards. It's a total lock-in down at the bottom of the well. Now, let's talk briefly, because that's all the time I have, about the validation committee. It was an invalid validation committee with an invalid process and with invalid results. Let's talk about the committee briefly. Most of them were either connected to the testing industry or were located in schools of education. There were a few people who were involved with the schools. There was one mathematician on this validation committee, which was to assure, number one, that the standards were internationally benchmarked, two, that they were research-based, three, that they were rigorous. They are neither of the above, none of the above. There was one mathematician on the validation committee, and I was the only English language standards expert. This already suggests that we do not have a valid validation committee. The process can be described by what we had to do at the first meeting. Sign a confidentiality agreement that we would never tell about anything that happened at these meetings for the rest of our lives. I've been very active in my home community, various kinds of political bodies and committees. Never have I ever signed a confidentiality agreement. But of course, these were private organizations putting together Common Core standards using totally unqualified standards writers. Two, and I will focus on English language arts. David Coleman and Susan Pimentel had never taught K-12, had never taught above K-12, had never published a thing on anything to do with education of a serious nature, and basically were unfamiliar with standards writing in K-12 for the English language arts. Who hired them, what they were paid, why they were hired, we still don't know because you can't FOIA anything from two private organizations that contracted with these people. The result was that 5 of the 29 or so members of this committee did not sign off on these standards as being benchmark, research-based, rigorous, because they weren't. What are the problems specific to ELA? And I'm going to whisk through those because I think I only have about 5 minutes or 3 to tell you about the flaws in these ELA standards. Basic philosophy is that if you don't have first-class standards, there's no point in having any at all. You don't want to be frozen into something less than first class. First of all, ELA standards are content-free skills for the most part. Content-free skills are the kinds of statements that can be applied to anything from the Three Little Pigs to Moby Dick. They contain nothing that indicates level of reading difficulty or cultural content. Common Core standards in English language arts also stress writing more than reading at every grade level. And every good teacher knows that reading comes first, must have a priority. All good writers are good readers. You have to have exposure to well-written English prose to become a good writer. Yes, you need to practice writing, but reading must be dominant. And they got it exactly wrong, the opposite. Third, Common Core's writing standards are developmentally inappropriate at many grade levels. I'll be happy to give examples later. Fourth, and this has been a very contentious issue across the country, it expects English teachers to spend at least half of their reading instructional time at every grade level on something called informational text. 10 standards for reading information, 9 standards for literary study at every grade level from K to 12. This means, in effect, reducing literary study, increasing something called information, and it is through this portal called informational text that we are being flooded with inappropriate reading materials in every single classroom. And the horror stories have yet to be compiled and made available in any systematic way. One can always say, as Common Core supporters do, that it's the implementation, not the standards, but the standards allow the floodgates to open up for all of this, and there is no way in which quality controls exist from state departments on down to ensure that we will have a classical curriculum of any kind available. Finally, I'm going to say that while Common Core's promoters talk about the standards being fewer, clearer, and deeper, they are none of the above. They are fewer only because lots of different objectives have been bundled into one statement. I know that trick. You put semicolons and colons between a number of activities, call it one sentence, but it's really 4 or 5 different things at once. So it looks like they're fewer. They are not clearer, they're muddier, and they certainly aren't deeper because we now have English teachers teaching excerpts from Romeo and Juliet or the Iliad or the Odyssey because there's not enough time to spend reading the entire work. So there is no depth coming into the English class. Whatever was there before, and there were lots of problems before, they have now been aggravated, and we have even less for those parents who want to see a first-class education for their students. So I will stop here.
Okay.
Good time.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr.